Hello, this will be a video lesson that I'm hoping will help you in reading our literary work, Hymn to the Sun. Now, Hymn to the Sun is actually an Egyptian hymn. Now, as far as the literary genre of a hymn, I just have a quick little definition up here for you, kind of an overview of the actual genre of hymn writing. Keep in mind that hymns, of course, are songs of praise, generally to a god or a deity. Now, of course, this particular hymn, this was a hymn that was written by the pharaoh Amenhotep IV. Now, he actually changed his name later to Akhenaten, and essentially that was a name that he selected because he wanted to change his name to Akhenaten because that meant Aten is satisfied. He worshipped the god Aten, which we'll be getting into that in more detail later. Now, you may want to look back at this particular website. It's just study.com, and it's the hymn definition examples. But really, you just want to focus on the fact that hymns, they are, in a sense, they are songs of musical praise. They're lyrical poems. If you're someone who attends church, you likely have sung these types of hymns. Now, you are going to have a homework activity later where I assign you to find a hymn, and you're going to compare that hymn to Hymn to the Sun. But please let me emphasize, you in no way have to actually be someone who believes in that particular God. And I encourage you to, obviously, if you're maybe someone who's a Christian, you may want to search out hymns from another religion, such as a Buddhist hymn, a Wiccan hymn, whatever you want to do, just to see the similarities in the types of hymns that are out there as far as a genre of hymnal writing. Okay, now, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the hymn, which is Akhenaten's Hymn to the Sun. Now, we're not going to break this down in detail by any means because you're likely, when you read this, you're going to notice that this is essentially a stanza by stanza praise of his great god Aten. And I do want to make sure you understand kind of how this related to Egyptian history at the time period, because when Akhenaten wrote this particular work, in many ways it was very controversial because he was trying to change the entire religious belief system of Egypt at the time. Akhenaten was worshiping one god. He was a monotheistic believer. And this was in a time period where the Egyptians were still coming from his father, Amenhotep III, believing in polytheistic gods, multiple gods. So Amenhotep essentially tried to completely change the religious atmosphere of Egypt during that time period. So let's actually look at the slideshow, and we're going to talk about kind of why this was so controversial. Now, you'll notice I do have a PowerPoint for you. Now, I think when most of us think of Egypt, we likely think of images like the pyramids, the Sphinx, Cleopatra, the great, of course, female pharaoh. But I want you to understand, as far as historically, Egyptian literature is very rich in history. Now, what's really cool about Egypt is its climate is very dry. Okay, it is a desert-like terrain, which is great for preserving papyrus paper, which many of our literary works were written on that type of paper. I have, if you'll notice in the slideshow, kind of a slideshow background that's papyrus paper. That was the type of paper that many of their literary works were written upon. Also, many of their literary works were found archaeologically through ceramic ware. In the same way, when we were studying the classical Greek and Roman epics, many of their stories were told through ceramics artwork. We also were lucky enough in basically fragments of broken pottery, which were called sherds or ostraka. They told us a story, and essentially they told us much about Egypt's kind of background and history and understanding of life and death, sexuality in a sense. Now, also, many of our Egyptian literary works were preserved through writing, hieroglyphic carvings in temples, monuments, tomb walls, which of course have been discovered with pharaohs. Now, Egyptian writing, it really kind of gained infamy when there was discovery of mortuary writing. Probably one of the most famous literary works discovered was the Book of the Dead, which this, of course, was a portion of that particular literary work, which is essentially kind of a guidebook to the afterlife for those who go to the other side. Now, as far as what we're going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at a time period in Egyptian history when we had a political leader who tried to completely change the whole landscape of his kingdom. Now, there are so many different time periods in Egypt. I mean, from the Old Kingdom, the Middle, the New, the Ptolemaic, kind of Egypt time period. We're only looking at a small fragment of that time. We're going to be looking at what a time period in the New Kingdom. Now, the New Kingdom lasted between 1550 to 1069 BCE, which is before Christ existed. But specifically, we're looking, you'll notice in the time period of 1375 to 1358. And this was a part of the time period known as the Amarna period. Now, I do encourage you, if you can, if you go to Canvas, you're going to notice there in letter B beneath module 15, there's a documentary. It's a video. It is awesome in explaining why Akhenaten, his presence in Egyptian history completely changed in some way momentarily. His own perceptions of, a deity, also his attempt to force his belief systems on his people, and how it's a little blip in history in Egypt when its whole landscape changed momentarily. And it wasn't one that was taken necessarily lightly. It was very controversial at the time period. So make sure you try to get a chance and watch some of that. Okay, let me go back to our slideshow. Now, again, if you'll notice, as I told you, Amenhotep the Fourth, as he was born, he had some daddy issues. If you watch the documentary that I just mentioned, you'll kind of understand why he had those father issues. And that did kind of influence kind of his later actions as a ruler. Now, he attempted to completely change the spiritual, the religious atmosphere of his kingdom because he wanted to shift his kingdom from a polytheistic belief system, one that believed in more than one God, to a monotheistic belief system. This was a huge change. Kind of imagine if we had someone who came into rule who was of the Muslim faith, and they said that by, essentially by within a year's time that every person in the United States would have to be Muslim or face uncertain doom. Would that be taken lightly? Obviously not. Okay, so it would be very, very controversial. Now, as far as his whole goal, he wanted to completely transform the landscape of his kingdom. He wanted everyone to believe in just one God. This God was Aten. Aten was the sun god. Now, he even built a capital city. Now, it was unfinished because of his death, and it was called Armenia. Notice this is the Amarna time period because of kind of the name of that capital. After his death, it was completely abandoned, okay, and it was left there unfinished. Now, I do want you to understand when Akhenaten took the throne, he was not light in his attempt to change the political and religious landscape of his kingdom. He essentially went through his kingdom, he defaced, he destroyed anything that related to the previous gods. Now, these are gods that individuals had been worshiping for centuries, okay? I mean, just for example, this is just a bust of Akhenaten, but he, of course, wanted to do away with worships of gods such as Ra, such as Horus, and he wanted to change that whole belief system. He had the sculptures of them essentially destroyed. He had any remnants of literature on of course, on tombs, on monuments, to completely deface. People were not happy with this, but of course that was their pharaoh. They had to kind of very mutely take it. Now you can imagine after his death, everything came back. Okay, it was very short-lived. Now, Akhenaten was not the only one who was in the worship of Aten, the sun god. Now, Akhenaten was a part of the cult of Ten, and that's a group of Egyptians who paid homage to the physical orb to the sun. Now, Akhenaten was very similar to their belief systems, but he essentially almost had this sort of conglomeration of three gods, almost like a Ra, Horus, Aten. If you're someone of the Christian belief system, think of the Father, Son, Holy Ghost scenario. He combined those three gods into one who was, in a sense, the sun god. Now, as far as synthesizing these gods, he essentially created this image of Aten. Now, if you'll notice in this drawing, this artwork, this engraving, we have Aten here. Now, Aten was physically the sun disk, okay? Past gods were anthropomorphic. They usually had a human body and an animal head, okay? This was completely different from those previous depictions. Also, usually in the past, you had gods that were represented by themselves, like we had previously with that other god by himself in artwork. Now, Akhenaten completely changed kind of artwork, not just literature, not just religion, but artwork. He wanted his wife Nefertiti, their daughters, their son, to basically be in all of the image with Aten, where the sun god was blessing their family. You had images of a parent and a child with Aten blessing the family in that. So keep in mind, this not only was a time in history where the religion was changed, it also changed the dynamic of the literature. We're reading Hymn to the Sun, which is an example of that. Also, it changed the artwork of the time period. Again, Akhenaten destroyed the artwork of the previous generations. Thankfully, not all of it, because much of it came back. And then also he changed his religion and also the depiction of his religion in that artwork. Now, you're going to notice in his worship of the Aten, usually in the literature and also in the artwork, you usually have this image of the pharaoh and his queen, Nefertiti, and they essentially are being directly blessed by Aten. Akhenaten perceived himself as the son of Aten. Now, where this was problematic was this, because in Akhenaten's mind, he was the son of God. So only Aten could directly bless him, and then through him, he could then bless his people. So you're noticing there's this wall, this separation. So Aten, this god, could not have direct interaction with the people. Essentially, Akhenaten had to be sort of the intermediary. You can probably imagine individuals didn't feel a connection with this god, this sun disk, because they couldn't have that direct connection with them, because only Akhenaten could have that. Also, this was a god they weren't really necessarily believing in. They were doing it kind of to save face, also to preserve their life in front of Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten. But after Akhenaten's death, you can imagine they put away that belief system of the monotheistic god Aten, and they went back to their previous gods. So I just wanted you to understand this was a very controversial time period at the time period. Now, when you read the hymn, you're going to notice a lot of Egyptian poetry is in couplet form. This one is not, okay? We're going to see later with some Egyptian love poetry, it is in couplet form, kind of that two-line rhyme scheme. You're going to notice in the hymn, there's tons of symbolism, lots of nature symbolism and imagery, tons of that going on. And you're going to see what we see as a modern reader as personification of the sun. That was not personification during this time period. From Akhenaten's viewpoint, this is essentially the god Aten, okay? You're going to see tons of alliteration, a repetition of those, consonant sounds, as well as metaphors as well. So when you read through that poem, you're going to see it is very traditional to a hymn. When you read through the hymn, you're going to see, if you're someone who is a Christian, you're going to see adjectives that are very reminiscent of a Christian hymn. You're going to see like, fine, great, radiant, okay? These are things that you hear constantly in many churches on a Sunday morning, okay? Now, as far as what I'd like for you to do with this particular poem, I want you to read through it, okay? Really appreciate how this was very different and unique for the time period. This was a time period in Egyptian history which shifted from a polytheistic religious belief system to a monotheistic, a one God belief system. And it was very controversial, okay? It wasn't taken lightly. Keep that in mind. Also, what I would like for you to do is I want you to take the time to do a quick activity. Now, this activity is going to be due on Thursday, so let me minimize this. Now, you're going to notice if you go to our Canvas page, it is D Modern Hymnal Activity, okay? And when you click on that, this is what you're going to have. Now, again, this is the activity I was mentioning. You don't necessarily have to have a belief system in the hymn that you select. It can be Christian. It can be Buddhist. Okay. It can be Confucianism. It doesn't matter. Okay. I want you to just, if you want to print this out, you can print it out and then scan it back to me or photograph it. Select a hymn, put the song, the hymn title in quotation marks. Also list any similarities that you see to Hymn to the Sun or the Hymn to Aten and the major differences. These differences could be like poetical devices, as I know, like the tone of the speaker toward the god, the deity. Any poetical devices like metaphors, personification. And I hope that you find this interesting. This is not going to be the only Egyptian poem we look at. We're going to transition to some Egyptian poetry that is very much erotic and sexual. So this is completely different from that particular unit. But I hope that you'll find this an interesting glimpse into the genre of hymnal writing, which is just as exciting and interesting as epic poetry writing. Thank you.